It's a vital piece of knowledge for any developer.
That's really important right there.
Yep.
All right, everyone, welcome to our Friday Tech Talk. My name is Rick, and I am here for part 2 of Erik Gross's Tech Talk. He is covering a to-do application built in JavaScript. Last week was really good. He covered the way he thought about setting up his program and the research that he did for finding things that he wanted done with the application. And I think we got to where he was showing the to-do list, the list items in the HTML. So that's where we're going to pick up. But Erik is going to definitely do a review first. So without further ado, welcome Erik Gross. He is a co-founder of the Tech Academy, and he's a great guy and a great developer.
Wow. Okay. Someone said nice things about me. I'm glad this is being recorded for posterity. Hi, everyone. This is Erik Gross. Yeah, I'm the co-founder of the Tech Academy. I'm a working developer, have been through the entire period of time that Jack and I and our team have put the Tech Academy together. And I love teaching. So what we're going to do right now, again, this is part 2 of a 2-part project to use the idea of building a simple to-do application in JavaScript as a demonstration of how to think like a developer, what the 5 basic elements of any computer program are, regardless of the computer language that you're learning, and seeing those 5 elements in action. So what I'm going to do right now is do a bit of an overview or review of what we were doing last week and where we got to. And so I'm going to start sharing my screen. If you guys will give me just a second. That clickety-clack you hear in the background, by the way, this sort of clickety-clack like that, that is a keyboard called DOS keyboard. It is one of the real old school clicky-clack keyboards. It's not quiet or soft at all, and it is an absolute pleasure. I treated myself a couple years ago. So if you're a fan of old school keyboards, either go on eBay and find one for a few $100s, or buy a DOS keyboard. They're the best. Okay, good. So let me do sharing. All right, and then let's go to Visual Studio Code. All right, so I have 2 different files of code here on the screen, and I want to explain what they are. Let's open up the File Explorer here on the left. The application I'm using is clearly Visual Studio Code. You can see it up here. I have a folder called To Do App, and in that folder, I only have 2 files: an index file, which is HTML, and a JavaScript file called app.js. Let's go to the index file. It's right here. It's quite simple. Let's close the editor so you can see more of it. All I have is, my doc type to let the browser know that this is an HTML5 page. I have a language designation. I have a head element, and in here is the character set that I'm using. This is my character encoding. And I have a title and some metadata in case this ever went live on the web, which it won't. There's stuff that can be scanned by various, applications out on the internet to get some kind of a sense of what this page is all about. I don't have any CSS being applied, so I've commented out my style sheet line here. And really, honestly, there's only a couple of things going on right here inside the body. If you look at the body, I've got a little header so that I can actually see, what this thing is all about. And I have an input followed directly by a button. This input is where a person is meant to type in their item for whatever they want to do. You're making a simple to-do list, right? Go get groceries, fix your bicycle, whatever it is. And this input, this HTML element called an input element, is where you would type in that text. And the button immediately following, which says in terms of the text inside the button, create item, is what you would click on to create the item. And finally, the only other real element we have on here of any concern is a div right here, which is empty. This is where the to-do list that gets created will get rendered. So finally, so that's all the HTML of any consequence. There's not a lot going on this page. The important stuff is being done by our JavaScript code. And you can see on line 20 right here that we're referring to a script file, JavaScript file called app.js. And app.js can be seen right here. App.js is where all the logic involved happens. So first thing I'm going to do right now is I'm going to demonstrate the state of the application right now because it's not done yet. And launch it. It's pretty simple here. What I've got is the HTML page that we were looking at, Erik's to-do application, an input, a button that says create item, and then the rendered list inside this div. That's what you see right here. And in fact, if we right-click here and use the browser's development tools, and you see all of the different elements on the page, you can see that this div that's holding the entire list, this div is the div with the unique ID of to-do list. And you can see that in the code right here. It says div ID to-do list, but it's empty. So how is it that when it gets rendered, there's actually content in it? Well, that's where our JavaScript code comes in. And it's, again, I'm going to do a review of the code we have so far so you can see how this is happening. I won't go super deep into that because, again, all that detail is in the first video. What we're going to do for this video is build the logic to delete these items. So let's go over the code, though, that's producing that list inside this apparently empty div. So let's look at exactly what happens from the very beginning. When this page right here, this HTML page, is given to the browser, and the browser does its job of parsing through each of these lines of HTML to figure out what it's going to render on the page, it does just fine on being able to handle anything as given until it gets to line 20. When it gets to line 20, it says, oh, before I can continue and fully render this page in the browser, what I need to do is go to this JavaScript file, app.js, and do whatever it tells me to do. And then when I'm done with that, then I can render the page. So what happens when it goes to this app.js file? Well, this is where those 5 basic elements of a computer program come to mind. And I'm going to go to the bottom of all this code, and just to help illustrate, I'm going to put a little comment block here. And inside it, I'm going to put those 5 basic elements of any program. And they are an entrance point, variables, control and branching statements. Let's see if I can type. Subprograms, and an exit point. Look at those briefly, because again, I go into much more detail on last week's video, and I want you to watch that whole thing. But briefly, a computer program has to have a first instruction. Where do I start? It has to have a corresponding exit point. The computer needs to know when it's done running that program. It has to make use of variables, uniquely named pieces of data that can change as the program executes. It has to make use of control and branching statements. The classic if this, then that needs to be made use of so that you can use your computer program to apply decision making and have different paths of execution or a different series of instructions based on the decision made in a control and branching statement. A computer program that's worth its salt will make use of subprograms, essentially mini programs that can be called upon as needed by the main program, so that smaller units of code can be repeated over and over again, and you don't have to type them over and over again. And if you need to modify them later, you only modify them in one place. And then finally, the exit point. So those are the 5 basic elements of a computer program. This is something we go into great detail on in the boot camp, and hopefully most people here have either reviewed that or that was a decent enough explanation. You'll follow it. So let's look at how this applies to our JavaScript. What I'm going to do is start from the top of this file, and we're going to find the first instruction that actually gets executed. This is important to a software developer because when you're given a new project, one of the most important things you can do in terms of figuring out how this sometimes quite large application actually works is go as early in the program execution as you can find to access with a tool called a debugger, which will stop the program in execution at a specific point and then let you step through one instruction at a time. Go as early as you can inside that computer program's path of execution and put what's called a breakpoint, a thing that will tell a debugger to stop right here. Let me see what the program's doing. And when you do that, you can start to step through the code and see what it's all about. It's very valuable for a developer, like I said, given a new project. So let's look for this huge program. It's all of 44 lines of code. Let's look for what's the first actual instruction that gets computed or gets executed. So if we go to the top, when the browser over in index.html is told to go to app.js, it'll literally have a little program inside the browser that's called a JavaScript engine, which will start reading through this code line by line, and it's looking for what's the first piece of code I can actually do something with. What's the first piece of code that tells me to perform an action? And it's not line 2. This is simply the subprogram element. When we go down here to those 5 basic elements of any computer program, in JavaScript, they're called functions, repeatable blocks of code. So on line 2, we define a function called getToDos, but it doesn't tell anything to happen. It's just a predefined function that when called upon will run the code on lines 6 through 13. So this is not the entrance point of the application. Next on line 16, excuse me, we have a function called add. Same thing. This isn't going to run. No one told it to run yet. It's a predefined template for code to run when the add function is called upon. Same thing on 25. This is a function called show. It doesn't get executed. Now let's look at line 43. This piece of code can be executed. It's not a predefined function. It is, in fact, code that the JavaScript engine in the browser will get to and go, oh, I can do something with this. What's it going to do? Well, it's going to find the object that it's been maintaining called the document. This is the document object model, essentially an API into the web page that you're about to render. Every element in the web page that you defined over here in index.html, every element in there is represented in this document object model. The document object model comes with its own subprograms, repeatable bits of code. These are called functions, or methods, actually. This method locates a specific element on the page and needs to receive something to identify that method. In this case, it's looking for the ID, something to identify that element. In this case, it's looking for an ID on the page. The specific ID is create button. Well, let's look back at our HTML, and right here is create button. That's the ID on this element called a button element. So what does this code in JavaScript do? The first piece of code that can actually get executed, the first part of it, it's 2 parts separated by this period right here. 2 things are going to occur here. The first thing is called get element by ID. So it locates the element with the ID of create button. Then on that element, it performs another method. It adds what's called an event listener to it. This now sets up a continuously running program in the browser associated with this specific element, the create button element. And this continuously running program in the browser is waiting to see if someone clicks on that button. If that happens, then this function is executed. So this is the first line of code that will get executed. And all it does, it doesn't make any changes to the user interface, to the web page that gets rendered. But behind the scenes, it attaches to the button right here a thing called an event listener. Good. What's the next piece of code that'll get executed? This method called show. Now we can dig into what's actually going to happen. But first, let's see this piece of code in action. Let's go back to our browser. And let's go over to, let's see, sources. This is the HTML and JavaScript that have been received by the browser. Let's look at our code here in app.js. And oh, good, I've already got it. A breakpoint, which is what this red dot is, on this line, line 43. The developer tools available in Chrome, which is the browser I'm using, allow stopping the execution of your programs at any point by adding a breakpoint to them. So I'm going to run this, and I'm going to do so with a breakpoint on line 43, the very first line of code that this program, because this entire page right here is a program, the first line of this program that's going to be executed. So I'm going to refresh this page. And look, I hit the breakpoint. Right now, the browser, Chrome, is running a tool called Developer Tools. And in that, a tool available as Developer Tools called the Debugger. And this debugger has paused execution on line 43. So if we look at this element with an ID of create button over here at our elements, this is the button right here. And we look over at any event listeners that are tied to this button, there aren't any. There's nothing here for hovering over the element, for clicking on the element. Nothing like that. But now let's go back to our code. Let's execute this line of code by hitting this button that says step over next function call. I call it F10 because if you hit the F10 button, it does the same thing. Click on it. And now let's go back to our elements. Go away. And look, now there's a click event listener associated with that button. We can open this up and it'll tell you details about the event listener. What it says is on this button with an ID of create button, that pound symbol is ID, there's an event listener and it points to this exact line of code in our app.js file. You can even click on it and it'll take us to that code. Look at that line of code. It's the add function. So all that tells us that our code on line 43 worked properly. We found the exact element on the page with a unique ID of create button. And then we added another function onto it called add event listener, which worked because it added an event listener on the click event that if a click occurs, runs the function called add, which you can see right up here. So that line of code worked. Well, now let's look at what's about to happen on the next line of code that can execute, which is line 44. Line 44 just says show. Well, what does that mean? It means run the show function. Where is that? It's right here on line 25. So this is about to get executed, and we can even put a breakpoint in it. And right here, you see the highlighted line is line 44. Line 44 has not been performed yet. But if I hit F10 and step, it'll jump into the actual show function. Let's do that. Look at this. I'm now inside the show function, and I'm about to do line 27. What does line 27 do? Well, it creates a variable called to-dos and makes that variable equal to whatever gets returned by another function called getToDos. Let's find that function. There it is, getToDos. Well, let's put a breakpoint in there. We're now another level deep in subprograms. We've gone from the main program on this instruction line 44 into the subprogram called show. This subprogram has itself called another subprogram. And I'm using subprogram in this context right here, the 5 basic elements of any program. In JavaScript, these are called methods and functions. So I've gone from the main path of execution into a function called show. That function is itself calling a function called getToDos. And now I'm about to go into that. So here I am on line 27. It has not been executed yet. If I hit F10, it'll jump into the get to dos method or function. And look, now here I am inside the get to dos function. So now let's see what it does. Now we're going to start to really get into the actual logic involved, because we want to point something out. Over on the left here, we don't have any to-do items displayed. In fact, if we go to elements and look at our to-do list div, it is empty. There's still nothing there. Let's see how it is that we end up getting something to populate inside that div. Go back to our sources, our code, and let's see what happens. We create a new array called to-dos. Let's do that. This is now an empty array, and Developer Tools shows us square brackets indicate an array, but there's no elements inside that array. It's empty. Then we're going to make a string called to-dos string, and it's equal to the result of going into local storage and running a get item function. And there's an item in local storage with a unique key of to-dos. Let's look at local storage, which is storage that the browser can save onto your computer for use from one session to the next on web pages. So let's go here to application, and in here is local storage. And in local storage, I have a couple of key value pairs. Here's the key, here's the value. There's a key called to-dos, and in it you can see the value. And in fact, these developer tools are so friendly, they've even presented that value down below in what's called JSON format. Here it is JSON. Like here's an array with a whole bunch of elements. How many? Well, 11 of them, because you start counting at 0. These are all the different elements of to-do items. So that's stored as a string down on my computer. The browser, Chrome, was directed in, last week you would have seen how, was directed to save this string, eat ice cream, go get groceries. This exact string right here was directed to save it and associate it with a unique key called to-dos. So let's go back to our code and see what's going to happen. We're going to get that item. So look right now at to-dos string. If I roll over this, it's undefined because I have not executed this line of code. Now I hit step, and look, now this variable, to-dos string, is equal to that string that we saw down inside local storage. So we've pulled something that was saved in a file on the computer and are now holding it in memory as a string. The next thing we do is we check, first of all, to see whether or not we have a null variable here, whether to-dos string actually retrieved anything. If it didn't retrieve anything, if it was null, then we're not going to try to do anything with it because there's nothing there to be done. In this case, it isn't null. You can see that it's equal to this big string that's highlighted in red right above it because I'm rolling over it. What are we going to try to do? Well, we're going to try to use a class that's built into JavaScript called JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. And we're going to take this string called to-dos string, and we're going to convert it into an actual JavaScript object, into an array, in fact, because we have an empty array. Here we have a string that is actually representing an array, but it's just a string. It's just characters. It doesn't represent an actual array. The computer will not be tracking each individual item in this array and associating an exact index in the array with it, because it's just a string. It's just characters. It might as well just be gobbledygook. It means nothing beyond just being a string as far as our computer program is concerned. So we need to take it and convert it, assuming it's written properly as an array, from a string into the array. So let's see if that works. First, let's do step from the if, and this is definitely not null. This string is definitely not null. We'll click once. And look, we're allowed to go inside these curly brackets on the if statement because, in fact, to-dos underscore string was not null. And now we're about to try to take this string and turn it into a JavaScript array. We click, and look, my to-dos array now has 11 items. I can even roll over it and see all those 11 items. So we've successfully taken data that was stored somewhere else, in this case in local storage, It was persisted in a permanent storage area, and we've pulled that into an in-memory object, in this case, the to-dos array. This is a pattern you're going to see all the time as a computer programmer. Typically, we wouldn't be getting the data we need from local storage. This is just for illustration purposes. Normally, that would be on a totally separate computer in a database. That's where we'd be storing those things. So on this line 9, in a quote-unquote real computer program, you typically be executing some kind of a computer program code to retrieve data from a database. And then you take that and use it and convert it to an in-memory object called an array. Fine. Our code worked. We created a new array that was empty. We pulled the string from local storage that represented our to-do items. We converted that string into that array that we declared. It's no longer empty. It's got 11 items in it. And now this piece of code, this get-to-dos function, is going to return that array. Now, who's it going to return it to? Well, you could either try to remember that, in fact, it was, I think, the show function that called it, or you can go over on the side here, and it has what's called a call stack. This is a stack of all the different function calls that have happened in order. And it starts with the oldest at the bottom and moves up to most recent at the top. We are, in fact, in the get-to-dos function. And you can see this little blue arrow indicates, and this is all a tool available in these browser developer tools. The little blue arrow indicates this is this function is currently being executed. And you can see it's currently being executed. We're on this line of the function. What was it that called that function, the get-to-dos function? It was the show function. It's the next one down. And you can see that, and we all remember, because there's the breakpoint, that we were executing this line of code on 27. And it, in turn, called this function. So when get-to-dos executes this return to-dos instruction, it will give this array to whoever called it. Specifically, it was called on this line of the show function. And so what's going to happen is the return object, which is this array of 11 items, gets returned, and its values, those 11 items, get assigned to this variable. Now, they are named the same thing. They are named to-dos. But this array up in the function called get-to-dos, this array called to-dos, is not the same array as this. Now, JavaScript is funky about that. Unless you explicitly stop it from doing so, it'll assume they're probably the same thing. And you'll notice it's already kind of given it the same values. You can change things like that by giving it a different name, which is probably the smarter way to do it. In fact, I'm going to change that right now. I don't like that. Let's go to our code, go to our app.js, and in our show function, which is what we're running, I'm going to call this current to-dos. I like that. And now I've used that variable name in several places. I need to change it wherever I use it. Okay, good. Now let's go back to our code in the browser. Let's run it. Let's go back to where we are. Let's bing. All right, we're at the beginning of get to-dos. I'm going to get us back to exactly where we were before. Okay, we were right on this line of code. Now, nothing else has changed. We started with line 44 in terms of execution, which was the show method. In the show method, which is the next thing up, we were directed to run get-to-dos. In get-to-dos, we created a new empty array. We retrieved the string from local storage that represented that array. We converted that string to an actual JavaScript array. And down here, this variable, current to-dos, has no value right now. So now let's do what I was talking about. Let's return this now populated array with 11 items. Hit step. Step one more time. And now I'm back. And notice that we're in the show function. Notice over here in the call stack, we're no longer listing get to-dos because we're done with it. It was fully executed. We're now in the show function. And in the show function, we finished running line 27. And so now when you roll over current to-dos, it's equal to those array, the array. In fact, the array that was produced by running the get to-dos function. Good. So we have this array. It's still not rendered over here. How are we going to do that? Well, the way you do that is you take each element in that array and you use it to make your own HTML. Now, I went into this in a lot of detail last week, so I'm not going to go into exactly how we did it. You can watch that. But we start by creating a string, which has unordered list. You can see that looks like HTML. It's just a string, though. So UL, which is the opening tag for an unordered list element in HTML. We take that, and then we add to it for every single item in the array, the characters for list item, and then the text inside the current to-dos array, either, eat ice cream, go get groceries, fix a bike, or whatever. One after another, we add that text inside the list item characters. And when we're all done with that, we add an end the unordered list piece of text to it. So I'm going to put a breakpoint right here and run this whole thing where it rips through all 11 items and makes the string. Let's run that. So now we've jumped down to this line. We've run all of this code on lines 30 through 34. And you'll notice that this HTML as string, that is a string that's written as valid HTML. So now we can take that string. We can locate the element on the page called to-do list. Let's look at that element. There it is. It's empty right now. We can locate that element, and then we can set a property on that element called inner HTML. First, to an empty string, is to make sure there's nothing there. And then we do the same thing, and we set the inner HTML to this text. The browser will convert the text that you see highlighted in red into actual HTML and then render it. So let's do that. See it appear on the left. As soon as we executed line 38, we found that div with the ID of to-do list, and we set its inner HTML property equal to this string right here. And that string was converted to valid HTML. And in fact, if we go over to our elements, you now see that inside this div with an ID of to-do list, we have 11 list items. So what we've done is successfully taken, let's go back here, data stored in local storage, converted to an array, taken that array and taken each item of it to construct HTML as a string, use that string to change the actual HTML on a div in our page, and we have now rendered the current value of the list of all our to-do items. So that's to catch you up to speed. Now let's have fun. Let's see how to make it so we can delete one of these. So you notice a pattern here probably. Let's go ahead and just continue through the execution by resuming. And now we're done. We have a rendered list. Let's go back to our code. I want to be able to grab a hold of each individual item on that list and make it so I can click on a button and have it disappear. So the first thing I need to do is I need to make a button be part of the HTML that I'm writing. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say, before the end of the list item, this code right here, where I add my list item, I want to have a button on the actual line of text displayed on the screen for an individual item in my to-dos, on that line, on that list item, I want a button. So I'm going to make another string here. Right now it's empty. And by the way, working with strings is a pain in the butt. Watch how I did this. Let's go back to where I was. So this is where I am right now. This code works. We know it works. We just watched it work. I'm about to start to build more HTML as a string. And if I went right here, and after my plus, concatenating strings, that's what the plus is. I just did a quote. And if there was only one of them, Visual Studio Code is making this easy for me. If there's only one of them, or even if I left it like this, notice that I've got errors here. This red thing is an error. It's saying semicolon expected. Something's wrong. It's because I don't have the plus again. So this is my recommendation for working with strings, is before you start writing the content, because my content of strings that I want to create here for my button is going to go right where the cursor is inside those double quotes. But rather than writing the string that I'm trying to format, while there's errors on the page, make it valid with an empty string, and then I'll go in and start writing. All right, now what do we want to have here? Well, what we want is a button element. So start by writing the valid HTML for a button element. There's the opening element right here, and then the opening tag, and here's the closing tag. Great. Inside here, I just want a capital X to be displayed. I could type delete in the button as well, right? I just want an X. That's fine for me. I think that'll be intuitive enough for people. And it's an easy enough thing to change. The text is displayed in the button. So right now, let's just see whether or not it makes a button for me. It made list items. I think it'll make a button with the letter X, but I'm just going to try one little piece of code at a time. So let me go back. And by the way, I have autosave on right here. It's an option, and that's why I'm not having to hit Control S or go up here and click save it all. Okay, I just write my code and it automatically saves. I like that. So let's go see if this addition I made right here, trying to create a button associated with each to-do item, works. Let's refresh. In fact, let's close developer tools. Yep, it worked. Good, awesome. So I was able to add a button here. Now, if I right-click on any one button and inspect it, it's a perfectly valid button. Here's the list item. And on the same line as each list item is both the text and a button. Well, I need to be able to click on a button and have something happen. So let's look at the logic when we had a click event before. Right here on line 43, we created a click event. It worked really well. It was for this create item button. And I can use it right now and show you. Let's go swimming. That's a task I want to have, right? And if I click on create item, I've got breakpoints going. Let me run them all. Notice I have a new item here. I have go swimming added. So obviously I know how to create an event listener on here for a click. And again, I even showed that to you. Inspect. There's the element. Go over to event listeners. I can programmatically create a click event. Well, let's look at how we did it for this button and try to do it for all these buttons I just created. And we're about to learn a pretty important concept. So I'll go slow and pay attention. So let me close this. I want to have a lot more room for my code. The work we're going to do is right here on line 32. I want to have these buttons that I'm creating to have an event listener associated with them. Now, notice what we did before on line 43. When we wanted to add an event listener, we had to find an element by its ID And then there's an ID. Once we located it, we had to add an event listener for the click event, and we had to go to a function that was going to be executed. I'm going to work backwards here, and I'm going to write the bare bones skeleton of a function that we would point to. I certainly think it would be called delete item. I think that works. Makes a lot of sense. You can call it whatever. Do your little open and close semicolons because you're building a function. Give yourself some curly brackets. Do a comment. Here is where we delete an item. Great. I'm not going to build anything else in here. I just want to have it available. I want to be able to know the name of it because I'm about to try to create line 47. So let's work backwards again. So right here, I've set inner HTML. So as soon as I run line 38, that is when I actually have buttons on the page. Remember that until this point, until the point that line 38 is executed, I still don't have any HTML for my list rendered on the page. I'm busy constructing a string that will be used to create said HTML on the page. So if I'm going to add an event listener, I have to do it after here. So I'm even going to put a comment here. Add event listener to buttons for deleting. All right, good. So let's see what that would look like. Well, if I start writing it, I'm going to see my problem. Document dot get element by ID. Oh, darn. I don't know what the ID for a specific button is going to be. And this also makes me confront the fact that each of the buttons I'm going to make, because there could be a variable number of buttons. We have no idea how many to-do items someone's going to make. Every single one of those to-do items with this associated button, the button has to have a unique ID. Well, how do I do that? Let's go back up to where I'm making my buttons. If this were HTML and not just text that you're kind of shoving together, the ID would go here. You go like this. You go and you have some unique ID. What does this look like? It'd be like that. Something funky here with my formatting. Now, this is where you learn another really valuable lesson. Dealing with quote marks when you're trying to create strings is a giant pain. It's not fun because the quote marks are used by the code that works with strings to indicate, hey, everything inside of these two quote marks is the string. But we want to have a quote mark itself inside of the string. Now, how do you do that? Well, that's called escaping from the actual processing of these characters. Right now, we're processing characters with the assumption that quote marks are not part of what you're trying to use as a string. We need to escape from that standard method. So if we go here and open up a tab, we can go JavaScript escape double quotes. And it'll tell us some stuff. How to work with strings in JavaScript. Let's look at what's going on here. All right, string, sequence of one or more characters, letters, numbers, and symbols. Excellent. All right. Strings using double quotes and single quotes are effectively the same. keep consistent. Okay, so we could have single quotes or double quotes. We're using double quotes. All right. So let's see about storing a string in a variable. All right, you can take this string and assign it to the variable new string. String concatenation. This is where we're going. Okay. Concatenation means joining two or more strings together, create a new string. We use the concatenation operator, represented by a plus symbol. And that also is addition, but only when you're doing math. So C plus horse equals seahorse. Okay, good. All right, we've already successfully done that. So how do you deal with strings? Variables. Well, we've already dealt with variables. Where do we do that? We do it right here, plus poem. All right. Now, string literals and string variables. You might notice that the strings we write in the source code are encased in quotes or backticks. We're not going to get into backticks right now. That's this symbol right here. Notice that's not an upright single quote. Let me go back to my code. What they're talking about is this symbol right here. It's in the top left of your keyboard. It's above the tab key typically. And if you hit shift on that key, it's the tilde operator, which looks like that. Okay. That is called a backtick. And some of the more modern syntaxes that you can have in JavaScript use that to work with strings. We're not going to get into how or why within the scope of this course. This right here is a single quote. Notice it's upright. Again, this is a backtick. Okay, good. Awesome. So let's go back to that. It says, you might have noticed the strings we write in the source code are encased in quotes or backticks, but the actual printed output does not include any quotations. We need quotations. We're trying to create an ID. Right here on line 32, we want an ID. How do we do this? Escaping quotes and apostrophes in strings. All right. Double quoted string. All right. In order to avoid an error being thrown, we have a few options we can use. Opposite string syntax, escape characters, template literals. Okay. An easy way to get around isolated cases of potentially broken strings is to use the opposite string syntax. For example, apostrophes in strings built with double quotes. So you have double quotes on the outside. And since we're using double quotes, JavaScript does not treat this single quote, which an apostrophe is a single quote, right? It does not treat it as, hey, we're about to start another string. All right, well, we can't do that because we're already doing the whole double quote thing. We could switch it around that anywhere I have here double quotes, I could turn them into single quotes, but I have to rewrite a bunch of this code on these lines. I don't want to do that. Let's see if there's another way. Using the escape character. We can use the backslash escape character to prevent JavaScript from interpreting a quote as the end of the string. We can also use quotation marks in strings built with double quote. We are building strings with double quote. And look, then he said backslash hello world and backslash. So what I need to do is to put a backslash before the quote that I actually want to appear. Let's try that. I have right here, I tried this single quote thing, didn't like that. I have right here, this backslash, or this quote right here is the one I want to appear. So I'm going to put a backslash before it. And I also want this one to appear, backslash. Look, my errors went away. All right, good. So now I have things set up for the fact that right inside here is going to be a unique ID. What's the problem with the code I have right now? Well, we're going to run through this array called current to-dos. In this case, about 12 times, because I have 12 different items. In fact, let's run this code and see whether Erik can actually attach this ID, which is not a unique ID, as we're going to see. Let's see if that works. Well, let's go here to the To app. Let's, in fact, turn off. I don't want to see any breakpoints. Let's just refresh. And let's right-click on any one of these. Oh man, yeah, I've got errors here, and look why. So here is, let's go to the first list item right here. The ID is, unique ID. And the second one, the ID is unique ID. Well, that's not what an ID is. It needs to be unique. This isn't working. And I'm even throwing errors. Failed to execute get element by ID on this line of code. Remember, I have this document.getElement by ID. Well, I'm not done writing that. No wonder I'm throwing errors. But let's look back at this problem. I have in my elements a unique ID. Well, here's the good news. The HTML I created worked. The problem is I don't have a unique ID on each one. How do I do that? Well, is there anything associated with each item in this array, the current to-dos array, that is unique? Well, I mean, the actual text of it might be unique, right? I've got a bunch of unique ones, get groceries, whatever, but there's no guarantee that a user is not going to type in the exact same text. They could type get groceries, they have a big long list, and they forgot that they actually already have it on there, and they type get groceries the exact same way, and now we're screwed because now you don't have a unique value being used as your ID. What's unique? Well, part of the reason we're using an array here is that there is something unique about every single item in the array. Its index, its position in the array. If we go back and run our code here and actually just put a breakpoint where we can see this array. If I put a breakpoint on 30, I will have produced my array. Now let's refresh. I don't want to see anything until I get to where I was interested. Okay, here's my array. Notice that I actually have 3 different to-do items that actually happen to have the same text. If I were going to use this text as my unique ID, I'm really in trouble because it's not unique. I would have 3 different buttons with the exact same ID. And now I've got problems. So what is unique, though, is the index. And because working with objects, working with arrays is totally something baked into JavaScript, I can find out that index really easily. So I want my unique ID to be the index in the array of the item I am currently turning into text, into HTML. So right here, I want the unique ID. So I'm going to do plus. Oh, I need to end my quote. Remember that quote right here is a quote that we're actually wanting to produce. So I need to end quote. And then I need to add another quote. Okay, good. Something's wrong there. We'll figure it out. But right here, I need to produce a unique index number for each one. Well, check this out. Are we not starting with our counter variable, this loop? We're starting with our counter, our incrementer, at 0. And then we're putting the element in the current to-dos array at that exact index position in. So if I actually just put I right here, the actual value, well, let's see. The first time I go through this array, this is going to be 0. So I'm going to have an ID of 0. But this is good because the to-do item that I will be turning into text is item 0. And the next time through, I will be equal to 1. So the item at index 1 is going to be turned into text, and it'll have an ID of 1. I'm now going to have unique IDs. Okay, good. Let's see if this works, though. Go back. Continue with the old code. Notice that this old code is here because I have not yet had the browser request its resources again. Click refresh. Well, click continue through. Continue through. Fine. Now click refresh. And then let's just see. Let's step through. And let's watch the HTML as string variable. Let's watch it build. All right, I'm not in the loop yet. I'm about to be in the loop. Okay. Look at the ID of the first list item. It's 0. All right, let's go through the loop again. Now look at the ID of the second item. It's 1. And if you look at ice cream or eat ice cream and go get groceries, and now we look at the array itself, item 0 is eat ice cream. Item 1 is go get groceries. I have now tied the ID for a specific button to the actual matching element in the array. So I know that I'm uniquely identifying or associating a given button with a given item of our to-do. All right, okay, good. Now let's just run this bad boy. And let's run it again. All right, so now if I start looking at elements, inspect, I have the first one with an ID of 0, second one with 1, and so on and so forth, all the way to the last item, which is going to be an 11. I have an ID of 11. Okay, good. I have unique IDs. Now, if I go back to my code, I can start to actually add an event listener because I have in here an actual unique ID I can hit. Well, how do I do it though? Do I do add one for an ID of 0? Actually, it'd be quote 0. And then add event listener. And then the event listener is going to be on the click event. And it's going to run this delete item thing. Well, that works. But it would only add this event listener for the first item. And that's assuming I even have any items. When this application is used for the first time, there's not going to be any to-do items. Well, crap, how do I do that? Oh, doesn't matter how many are there. I have an array of all of them right here. So why not go through and run this code as many times as there are elements in the array? That's what I did right here on line 31. I ran this loop for as many items there are in the array. So let's try that again. Let's go, okay. So for let x equal 0, and then x less than current to-dos dot length, and then x increased by 1. All right, now I have a loop that will run as many times as there are items in the array. Now I can have fun with adding event listeners. I can take this code and put it in here. And now I'm going to run adding an event listener. Tab over, paste. And I'm going to do this each time by first locating an element with the ID of 0, and then 1, and then 2, and so on. And when I find it, I'm going to add an event listener that on the click event, I'll run delete item. Now I'm going to have click event. Okay, good. So let's see if I can actually add those event listeners. I'm going to loop through and add event listeners. So if I go here, and I don't want to run through all the code here. Let's just go refresh. All right, now let's look on any one of these items to inspect. Oh, I got an error. Oh, because Eric's an idiot. I is not defined. Well, yeah, it isn't because I forgot. And I was using X as my counter. All right, good. Let's change that to X. This is why Developer Tools is so awesome. Let's refresh. Try that again. Oh, let me close Developer Tools. Try it again. Inspect. No errors in the console. I have here button 6 is the one I happen to right click on. If I go over to event listeners, I have a clicked event associated with it. And it sends me to line 48, which is my delete function, delete item function. So I've successfully been able to link any one of these buttons to a delete item. Huh. Okay, fine. Now, how do I delete them? Okay, so I can jump into this code to delete an item. Well, here's the logic I think we should do, is we should get the list of to-dos again, and then we should get the ID for the button that was clicked. And then we should remove the element from the to-dos array corresponding to that ID. And the most commonly misspelled word on the interweb, the. All right, everybody get that logic? Let's get the list of to-dos. Let's get the ID for whichever button was clicked, because they all have event listeners. And then let's find the element in the array that matches that ID and remove it. And then finally, let's save the updated array. We updated it by removing something from it. All right, good. So I think we have most of the tools here to do this, with one exception. Get the list of to-dos again. Oh, that's easy. Var to-dos for edit. I'm going to give it a new name equals get to-dos. I already have this function. We built this last week. I can just make use of it. Easy. I now have an array representing all of the to-do items that are saved down inside local storage right here, because I'm going to run get to-dos. Okay, so I have the list. Now I need to get the ID for the button that was clicked. How the heck do you do that? Well, get the ID for the button that was clicked. Why don't we use the interwebs? JavaScript get ID for button. How to get the ID of button user just clicked. I have many buttons with ID attribute. Assume the user clicks on some button. I want to alert. The alert is the pop-up that appears on pages sometimes. It's built into JavaScript. I want to alert this ID of the button the user clicked. How do I do this in JavaScript or jQuery, which is a JavaScript library? Oh, look at this. Alert. That's what makes the little pop-up appear at the top of the screen. And you alert this. What the heck is this? Huh. Well, here's what this is. And you'll learn this on the JavaScript course. This can mean a few different things, but in the context of calling a function, write this. This is the object that called the function. Now that's valuable. What is the object that called the function? It's whichever button was clicked. So I can get the ID of it. I can go var foo. Oh, I don't use foo. I've used it too many times. Let's do the whole thing. Foobar. And for the history of foobar, just listen to last week's lecture or Tech Talk. So var foobar equals this dot. How do I get that element of the ID? So it said this dot ID. Let's see if that works. Let's see if we can extract the exact ID of the button that was clicked. before we do anything else with it, let's just see if this works. So I'm going to go back here. Now I do want a breakpoint. So I'm going to refresh. I've got plenty of breakpoints in here. All right. So what I care about is a breakpoint here in my delete item function right here. And I don't care about any of the rest of them. I already know this other code works. We've done a good job building this. Let's get rid of all these other breakpoints. They're just going to bother us. Let's run this and get right to this point. So I run the code and I click. Let's click on the first button, which has an ID of shocker 0. I'm going to click on it. Well, good news is I'm inside my delete item function. Second thing is this dot ID. I can already see it works. Look at that, guys. This represents the button. And you can see that in developer tools. You can see the button. In fact, we might be able to go down here to ID. Look at that. There's a lot of properties of this button. We're not going to get into all of them. Here's the inner HTML. It's the X that we created. But the ID is what we care about. So look, I can successfully get, this is undefined because I haven't executed it yet. Let's execute it. Click. I can get the ID of the specific button that was clicked. Now that was the first one. Let's see, does it work on any of them? I mean, it will, but let's click on it. Look at that. There's item 6. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The first time I'm going to burn the couch. Apparently, I really don't like the couch. All right, good. So let's get back to our code. So what we did, we got the list. We can get the ID for the button that was clicked. Now we want to remove that. So instead of calling this foobar, let's call this item ID. Good. That makes a lot more sense. All right. Now let's do remove the element from the to-dos array. How do I do that? Well, we know which one we want to remove. We want to remove the one at the index position corresponding to the ID of the button. In that last example I did, we want the item in the array at the index of 6 to be removed. So how do you do that? Well, let's go to our friend Google again and go JavaScript remove item from array. Gee, that's not popular. 9 ways to remove elements from a JavaScript array. Okay. Let's look at that sentence right there. You can remove elements from the end of an array using pop, from the beginning of an array using shift, or from the middle using splice. We don't know where it's going to be, so let's use splice. Let's see how that's done. Using splice to remove array elements. The splice method can be used to add or remove elements from an array. The first argument, look how they're using it. Here's an array with all these elements. Array.splice, and it's given 2 arguments. The first argument specifies the location at which to begin adding or removing elements. The second argument specifies the number of elements to remove. The third and subsequent arguments are optional. They specify elements to be added. We're not going to add, we're going to remove. So we need 2 arguments. We need the location and how many to remove. We want to remove 1. So we need something like splice. The first argument is the index, and the second argument is the number 1, because we want to remove 1. So let's see. I have an array right here. It represents all of the current to-do items. So if I do this, it said array.splice. Well, our variable is not called ARR or array, like theirs is. Our variable is called to-dos for edit. There it is, .splice. And I want to remove the item at the index of item ID. And I only want to remove 1 item. Let's see if that works. Can I remove it? Let's go back. I got me a breakpoint. I click refresh. And I'm going to remove this first burn. Well, I'm going to move one that'll be very obvious. Let's remove eat ice cream. Let's click on that. And if I execute once, I've got an item ID of 0. And now I'm going to take this array and I'm going to attempt to remove the item at index 0 and only that item. Click. Look at that. I no longer have one. There's a new index 0. It worked. It removed it. Okay, good. Great. But now what do I need to do? I need to now save this array because otherwise it's just in the memory inside the browser. I have to save it down into something permanent. So how do I save it? Well, this was from last week, but up here in the add function, where's my add? Right here. We know how to do that. You do this local storage set item. All right, so let's copy that. Notice it in here, the to-dos is the unique key for our string that we're storing inside local storage. The array that they happen to be using, they called to-dos. We have a different array, but let's copy this anyway, and we can change the name of the array. So let's go down here. It says we need to save. Well, what happened? I clicked in the wrong place. Come here. All right, if we paste this, we're going to set the item. It'll overwrite it. That's how local storage works. It'll overwrite the key value pair of to-dos, that key of to-dos, with the value of this array right here, to-dos for edit. All right. That should save everything in. So let's see if that works. Let's run this. We haven't got our new code up here yet. Let's refresh. So now we have our new code. You can see right here, the set item. Let's try to delete go swimming. Actually, let's try to delete eat ice cream. Notice it's still there because we never did anything to change what was stored in local storage. If I click on the X, suddenly I'm inside my delete item. I have an item ID of 0. And then I take my array and I remove the item at 0. Instead of 12 items, I now have 11 items in my array. And now I'm going to take that and watch this. Right now, I have 12 items in this array, including eat ice cream. That's what's stored right here. Once I execute this code, it'll overwrite the item with to-dos as a key. There's to-dos as a key. And put this new array with only 11 items in it. So click. Let's go back here. Notice ice cream is gone. And there's only 11 items in there, not 12. So now we have code that will, for any item, let's turn off developer tools and just watch it work. I can delete this burn couch. Didn't work, and I want to figure out why. Oh! Notice when I click on the thing, it doesn't re-render. I'm missing one step. Okay, I saved the updated array, and now I need to display the new list. How do I display a new list? Well, I built this function here called show a while back, last week. And show gets all the current to-do items. In this case, it will have changed because we deleted some. And then we know what else it does. It builds everything all over again. So I need to call show after I'm done deleting something. It's called show. Now let's go back. Fresh. All right. So now if I delete one, there's 4 fixed bikes. Look at that. One went away. Another went away. Another went away. Let's get rid of the burn couch. And let's start adding some things. Teach a class on basket weaving. And then that's read item. Oh, good. Awesome. All right. Oh, you know what? this is working. But notice if I want to add a new one, I've still got the text in there. I don't like that at all. I've got to hit Control A to select it, and then do a new one, which is eat, have lunch. And then click on Create Item. Now, have lunch, misspelled, it's still there. Let's delete it, type it the right way. So how do I handle this, guys? Once I click on this and it adds it, I want to clear out the contents of this thing. Well, what is this thing? Right click on it and use your developer tools. This thing is the input with a unique ID of to-do text. And we know when we're working with that thing, it's when, if you right click here, it's when the click event happens. And that's in this add function. So let's look at our add function and go, okay, here's my add function. I get the value of that input box. I get all the to-dos that are stored down in local storage. I push the new one that I just got because they typed it in into that array. And then I save that array back down into local storage. And then I display everything on the screen. I want to do one last thing. I want to get this element called to-do text, this input, and empty it. So I saw earlier that I can set the HTML, so I saw here that I'm getting the value. That's what I assigned to the variable task. I went, get this element with the ID of to-do text. That's this one right here, my input element. Let's get that and give me the value. The value is what was typed into the box. Okay, well, if that's true, can't I just do the opposite and set the value equal to nothing? Like this. I can say document dot get element by ID. I know that it's called to-do text. And in fact, here's a thing to learn. Copy it. Paste it so you don't get it wrong. This is case sensitive. For example, if I type lowercase t, that's not the same thing. So I've got the element, and then I can say value equals an empty quote. It's empty now. Let's see if that works. So now I can refresh this. I'm going to type something in here, and then it's going to be repair umbrella. I've got a real problem with my umbrella. It's not working well. And I'm going to create the item. We know that part works, but it should clear out this text box. And look at that, it did. So now I have a fully functioning application for the scope that we decided upon at the beginning of last week, which was that people are going to be able to create and delete to-do items. I can create them, and I can delete them. And again, as an overview of how that code works, let's just do a guided tour again. Here's your HTML page. It provides an input where people will put in with their to-do items, a button that's used to trigger creation of the item, adding it to the list. It has an empty div, which is to hold the list that gets created using our JavaScript. Then we have the JavaScript file, app.js, which gets referenced. And in that app.js, we have the definition of a bunch of functions. In fact, let me collapse. It's a nice little thing that Visual Studio Code does. Let's collapse all these. And you can see, let's get rid of these comments, that the actual code that gets executed initially is creating an event listener on the button, the create button. Then we display any currently existing to-do items. So now the page just sits there until someone clicks after typing data in. Then we have all our functions that work. We have the add function, which itself calls getting to-dos to find out what's already stored down inside local storage, turns it into an array and gives that array back. Add takes that array and adds whatever the person typed in to it, and then saves that back downside local storage and redisplays the list. And just as a nice friendly thing, clears out the content that the person typed. Here's that show function. And the show function is where a lot of fun happens because we get to build our own HTML using the items of the in the array that we retrieved from local storage. And once we've actually rendered them on the page, which happens on line 39, now they exist, including our all-important button for deleting. And we can go through the whole collection of buttons and add an event listener to each one. And then finally, if someone does click on that X for delete, we've provided a function for deleting. And the deleting can actually get the current items in the to-do, that are stored in local storage. It can get the ID of the button that was clicked. It can remove the corresponding item, and it can save everything back down inside the local storage and now show the new edited to-do list. So that was me throwing data at you for an hour and a half. I appreciate you guys listening to it, and I hope it was helpful. Right now, I want to open up the floor to anybody who's got questions.
And if somebody has a question they'd like to ask in the chat, there's a chat on the right. You can ask your questions there.
And I see 9 items in there already. Probably I missed super important things. Let me look what we got here. Welcome, everyone. Oh, the code is not in a repo. And to be able to make it, honestly, you're going to have to watch the video from last week and then just fast forward to that point and type it in yourself. I'd much rather that people work through actually doing this themselves, DA, than just copy it from a repo. Will that work for you to watch the last little bits of it? Oh, good. You answered. Thank you. You rock. All right. Okay, good. Any other questions via chat or just open up your mic? I'm fine either way. And we can go back to the code and talk about anything you want. Okay, cool. Well, guys, thank you very much. I hope you found this helpful. These, of course, are now going to be saved for posterity out on our YouTube channel. And again, I do recommend, there are probably people on this call that have gone through our whole boot camp and already did a bunch of stuff much more complex. But if you're at the beginning of your coding career, or more precisely towards the early parts of our boot camp, man, go ahead and do this. This stuff's pretty easy. You can do it. You can wait until you get to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript if you want to, but I don't think there's anything so complex here that you can't watch what I typed and make it work yourself. And I highly recommend it. So it's a fun little exercise. Again, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. And we'll catch you on another Tech Talk.
All right. Great Tech Talk, Eric. We appreciate it. And I'm going to delete my Evernote subscription now.
This is not a substitute for Evernote. Stop it.
Yeah, I love my Evernote, but this was great for seeing the logic of how to do a program and how to set up your functions and wire it all up. So really good information. Thank you.
Absolutely. I want to stress one thing before we go. You'll notice that there were several times where my code didn't work and I made a mistake. That's part of why I like to do these. I've been coding since I was 11 years old. I'm a big fat nerd, okay? I make mistakes every single day in coding. It's absolutely normal. And I'm just telling you that if you're in the middle of this and you're like, man, there's so much to learn and I feel like I gotta remember everything and my code doesn't work the first time and I'm a failure because it doesn't. Absolutely not. It happens to everyone. It's completely normal. Your code half the time is not going to work right the first time. It's totally okay. And so that's, like I said, part of why I do this. I want you to see that it's just totally normal part of stuff that you're like, oh man, I didn't think that through and I broke something. So there you go. Just one final point before we end off.
Yeah. And when you make your mistakes, when you get experience, you get a lot better at fixing them quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thanks, Eric. And if anyone wants to learn more about our school, you can go to learncodinganywhere.com. And yeah, we've got a lot of good information there. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. And maybe Eric will come back for a styling talk for this episode.
That's a good idea. Make this thing look pretty. And we can even add in like editing an individual item if you want, or marking an item for completion but keeping it in the list, that kind of stuff. So a lot of fun stuff you can do.
All right.
In fact, by the way, anybody listening to this right now, make sure this stays in the recording. If you get through this and you want to keep on working on some stuff, once you've got it working the way we do in this version, then absolutely have another little button here that says edit, or get fancy and make the text itself be clickable. And when you click on it, now you can edit it. You can change the text. Or you can click on a little button that says mark as complete. And then it'll stay in the list. It'll go to the bottom of the list with strike through text. Make it all fancy. In fact, I think you should just build an Evernote replacement like Rick keeps saying. But yeah, it's a great jumping off point for adding additional functionality. And each time you do, then you're going to be looking inside your code here and be going, okay, how do I compose this into a unique function that just does the one thing I need done? And how do I call that the right way? How do I put an element on the page that'll be tied to what I want to have happen? It's a really valuable skill, a really valuable exercise. So that'd be a fun thing for someone to do. I'll be glad to dive into it in a future Tech Talk too.
Okay, sounds good. All right, everyone. Thanks, Eric. We appreciate it. And yeah, stay tuned for our next Tech Talk.
Excellent. Bye, all.
Take care, guys.